They wandered along the shore, sinking into the darkness, and at last felt the same as any other couple in love on earth. They had managed to wrest their happiness from fate. When Dodi and his princess returned to the yacht, their faces glowed with quiet bliss. They had less than a day left to live. Their lives were valued by the global press in tens of thousands of dollars, and their deaths in hundreds. The final frame, capturing the twisted heap of metal in the dark tunnel, was worth millions. Now, at the British royal court, they say there was never any romance. Yet those who were close to them during those 6 weeks of a mad summer insist otherwise. These people were the servants, drivers, and personal security of Dodi Al-Fayed. Accompanying Diana and their master, carrying out his orders and errands, they became unwilling witnesses to what was not meant for anyone else's eyes. On the 14th of July last year, Dodi lazily watched the Bastille Day parade from the window of his luxurious Parisian apartment in an old mansion on the Champs-Élysées when the phone rang. It was his father, Mohammed Al-Fayed, with whom Dodi had a complicated relationship. The elder had long been irritated by his son's lifestyle, his cheap playboy fame, and his ventures in the film business, which yielded little success. But this time, his father's voice was unexpectedly gentle. Mohammed invited him urgently, that very evening, to fly to Saint-Tropez to the family yacht, Jonikal, where Princess Diana had already been for 3 days with her 2 sons. The way Dodi, abandoning all his plans known to the servants, rushed to Saint-Tropez showed that his father had offered him something extraordinary. Even the last servant in the house knew that the world was gripped by Diana mania, and of course, none of the master's pretty girlfriends could compare to the Princess of Hearts. Mohammed had introduced Dodi to Diana. He had been friends with her father, Earl Spencer, about 10 years earlier at a polo match between Prince Charles's team and Herod's. They had met a few more times since, but only briefly. On the Jonikal, something happened that Dodi had not expected. The princess had already begun to grow bored in the company of the elderly Al-Fayed. Even more, she was irritated by the paparazzi. The moment she appeared on the open deck or, God forbid, stepped ashore, she was immediately under the bombardment of cameras. Around this time, a photo circulated in the newspapers showing her being embraced on the shoulders by the elderly Egyptian. And then, a new face appeared. Dodi had always known how to impress women. Many said there was something mysterious in him, like the Egyptian Sphinx. And like the Sphinx, he knew how to listen. Diana opened up to him. She talked for hours. 5 days passed like a single moment. Dodi once again postponed all his business and rushed after Diana to London. Another 5 days later, his Paris apartment phone rang again, leaving the servants stunned and confused. This time, it was the master himself, speaking strangely, almost breathlessly. He was already in Paris with Diana. They planned to have lunch at a restaurant and then spend the rest of the evening at home. But this was a huge secret. The devoted security did everything to distract the paparazzi, and no one noticed as a blacked-out Mercedes slipped away from the rear entrance of the Fayed-owned Ritz Hotel on a warm July evening. The car delivered Dodi and the princess to a specially reserved private room at Lucas Carton restaurant, and then, weaving through the streets the same way, back to the mansion on the Champs-Élysées. The master called one of the servants to play an Iglesias disc. The astonished servant watched as Dodi and Diana stood, shyly holding hands. Outside the window, the lights of nighttime Paris sparkled, but the two of them only looked into each other's eyes. To the languid strains of the guitar, the flustered witness left them alone. The next day, Diana flew to London, of course, with Dodi, but he did not let his Parisian servants relax for long. Only 3 days later, a new call shocked the staff once again. This time, the master's voice was joyful and excited. "Get ready. Diana and I are heading to the Jonikal, just the two of us." The Jonikal was precisely the kind of yacht one could call fit for kings. Enormous, 180 feet long, with 2 decks and even a helipad, it stunned with its luxurious interior. Walls clad in redwood or draped in silk, floors of gleaming parquet, Persian carpets everywhere, and sofas soft as down. The vessel was served by a crew of 16, some of whom heard Diana, walking on deck with Dodi that evening, say, "How wonderful that we have come back here." He replied, "How wonderful that you have returned." They say that day Diana, barefoot, in a light jacket the same sky blue as her eyes, radiated happiness. She quickly remembered each crew member's name, demanded nothing from them, spoke on equal terms, and charmed everyone completely. The only surprising thing was how these two found so many topics to talk about for hours. That time, judging by the snippets of conversation, they spoke of the past. Diana's childhood had not been happy, even though she was born into one of England's wealthiest aristocratic families. Her father, Earl Spencer, had fervently wished for a son after the birth of 2 daughters. When another daughter, Diana, arrived, her parents were disappointed. A boy who would be named Charles was born a year later, and from infancy Diana felt unwanted and unloved. This feeling intensified during adolescence, when everyone around her saw her as an ugly duckling. Tall, she suddenly grew to 1 meter 82 centimeters. Clumsy and struggling in school, she was at a disadvantage compared to her older sister, Sarah. It was Sarah whom the parents and grandparents groomed to marry Prince Charles, and she, reveling in her independence, rejected the future king. The 16-year-old Diana was shocked when, 2 years later, the royal family finally chose her. She was blinded by the expectation of happiness. She, the extra child, longed so desperately for attention and love. It was all the more painful to realize later that Charles's choice was guided by his family and so-called state interests, while his heart belonged to another. Diana once again felt like the unwanted one. Her unfulfilled thirst for love drove her into the flash of cameras. Instead of a beloved, she gained the masses. It is hard to believe, but the playboy Dodi understood her like no one else. Just a year ago, finding no one close among his friends, he asked his butler in despair, "Can anyone really be trusted?" Dodi, who had access to all the material pleasures of the world, felt lonely and almost unhappy. Losing his mother at an early age, he had not been close to his father. His marriage to the model Suzanne Gregar was short-lived. He quickly realized that she cared more about his money and position than about him. When Dodi tried to share his problems with her, she would not listen. She either flipped through fashion magazines or watched television. They separated after 10 months. From that time on, Dodi constantly said that he would never marry again and would only enjoy life. Yet neither money, nor cars, nor yachts, nor endless parties, nor pretty women who fell easily at his feet. Nothing could fill the emptiness inside him. Only his nighttime ritual tea with mint, served by a loyal attendant, witnessed the depths of Dodi's soul. The small crew of the Jonikal, among whom were people who had known Dodi for years, were amazed by the change in him. It was as if he had found what he had been searching for all his life. Cristiano, the chef, who took great pride in his lunches and dinners, was deeply offended. The master and his guest were consumed not by food, but by each other and their endless conversation. Furthermore, the crew noticed that Dodi and Diana constantly sought physical contact. A hand, a shoulder, a leg. Even if their meals were served at opposite ends of the table, by the end, Their chairs were always side by side. Eventually, everyone felt it. The atmosphere on the Jonikal was electrified with love. For Diana and Dodi, blissful days began. They hugged and played in the water. And then Diana, wet and laughing with joy, would sit on Dodi's back and give him a massage. In the evenings, they danced and lingered on deck past midnight, the conversation only stopping when she, eyes closed, rested her head quietly on his knees. The air carried the melody from the English patient, filled with desire, sorrow, and secret ecstasy, perfectly reflecting their experience. Dodi would blissfully run his hands through her thick blonde hair, gently stroking her head like a little girl. The next morning, he called for coffee, and when the servant cautiously knocked at the master's cabin, no one answered. Dodi was waiting for his coffee in Diana's cabin. These were the golden days, during which the photo known worldwide as The Kiss was taken. Paparazzo Maurice Brenny earned $150,000 for it, and in total, he made $4,800,000 during that session, while the lovers floated in the clouds, ignoring everything around them. Even when a security guard pointed out a nearby vessel and expressed concern for their safety, Dodi only laughed. He would somehow protect himself and Diana from minor annoyances. On the 5th of August, the long-accustomed and star-studded public in Monte Carlo was stunned. The son of the famous Egyptian billionaire and Princess Diana, dressed simply, without makeup, in sunglasses, walked carefreely along the waterfront. Their cruise was nearing its end, and they imagined they could simply, like any other couple in love, stroll arm in arm, glance at shop windows, and sit in a small seaside bar. They had no idea that this innocent, like everyone else, walk would earn hunters hundreds of thousands of dollars. Only upon returning to London did Dodi and Diana realize the stakes. On one side, the elder Al-Fayed, for the first time in his life, was dominating his son with calls. The father was pleased. The boy was improving, and everything was going according to plan. On the other, the paparazzi, impossible to ignore, were everywhere. Dodi and Diana were declared open season. Their romance had become the world's main sensation. Cameras followed and fired at them constantly, from the airport and car to the gates of their home. Under this bombardment, Dodi tried to prove to Diana that he could give her not the golden royal happiness she had grown weary of, but a simple one. In London, in broad daylight, he invited her to the cinema. All 100 seats of the small private theater had been reserved in advance, so he did not take her in his 600th Mercedes, but in a small minibus. Just leaving the Fayed estate, they saw the eager sharks sniffing blood. Dodi and the princess immediately lay down on the bus floor and, like children caught in a war zone, laughed with delight at their trick. The next day, the newspapers would only see photos of the driver and security guard. The raid behind enemy lines was a success, and the banal action seemed like a masterpiece of cinema to them. By the evening, Diana's exuberant joy often bordered on hysteria. According to the same involuntary witnesses, she persuaded Dodi to fly by helicopter to Derbyshire to meet the clairvoyant Rita Rogers. She wanted to know what the future held. Upon returning, their faces gave little hint that the prediction offered hope. They decided to ignore the bad omens. If fate would not allow them happiness, they would create it themselves, in defiance of destiny. The remaining 10 days of their lives were spent in a fiery rhythm of passion. They returned to the Jonikal, the only place that still allowed them to dive into depths beyond the reach of telescopic lenses. Yet the next day, the security team noticed that cameras were no longer only aimed at the open deck, but even directly through the dining room window, capturing the lovers whispering tenderly to each other over lunch. The captain ordered tarps to be drawn over the yacht. Diana laughed. "It is too late, they have already taken everything." Dodi instructed the captain to turn the yacht 180 degrees and speed straight toward the rival vessel, as if seriously planning to ram it. When the enemy fled, Diana shouted with joy, hopping on one leg. To the captain, exhausted by the flashes, it seemed like a dangerous and absurd game with fire. Yet Dodi and Diana made it clear with every gesture. No matter how many people are around, it is just the two of us, and we are happy. That night, when tea with mint was served, they lay on a small sofa in the corner of the lounge, curled up together like children. The 29th of August was their last full day aboard the Jonikal. That evening, Dodi suddenly requested a farewell barbecue on the shore. The security reluctantly agreed. It was late, visibility was low, and the beach was unusually deserted. Everything was clear to everyone present. The flickering fire and the whisper of the waves. What could be closer to two hearts in love? On the morning of the 30th of August, they flew to Paris on the Fayed family's luxurious private jet. Its walls, covered with expensive fabrics, barely revealed whimsical Egyptian motifs. In a popular glossy magazine, Diana read a story about the playboy, the useless son of a wealthy father, who was attempting to rehabilitate his image through a scandalous romance with the princess of our hearts. They still had a day and a whole evening ahead of them. Diana lingered in the bath, preparing carefully for dinner, scheduled for 21:45 at the restaurant Cher Bonheur. Before dinner, Dodi, making sure the princess was not nearby, asked the butler to prepare chilled champagne for their return. With the expression of a child on Christmas morning, anticipating a miracle, he opened a small gray box from the famous jeweler Alberto Raposi. Sparkling on white satin was a magnificent ring of yellow and white gold, with a large emerald in a cluster of diamonds. Later, it would be valued at more than $200,000. The butler understood. The master intends to propose. After their deaths, these two, who had so suddenly found each other in the last days of their lives, were farther apart than ever. The entire world mourned and wept for Princess Diana. Dodi, on the other hand, was no longer of interest to the cameras. His father, having bet on the mother of the heir to the throne, had lost. And no one cared about the burial of his son at Brookwood Cemetery, not far from the Fayed estate in the picturesque English suburb of Oxted.